Alright, so now we're going in the opposite direction. We're zooming out of the webcam. I tried to put it back to where I had it last, and it feels a little small now. So we've gone from big head to small head. And but anyway, happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I do a meta review for the best of one, best of three in Standard. And every once in a while, if I see a interesting budget deck, I like to start things off with that. And this week we actually have two budget decks. So this one is Rise of the Varmints by Saffron Olive. And it's kind of centered around enabling this card, which we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And you get to create X 2/1 Varmints, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So we're just trying to fill our graveyard with a bunch of self-mill. Gnawing Varmint can mill ourselves. Philology Archaeologist, the Picklock Prankster, Cruel Somnophage can target player mills 4 cards, and then its power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards. Go for the Throat for a little bit of interaction. Shoot the Sheriff as well. Aftermath Analyst, which we've seen in the Temur Control landfall deck, and this one being able to bring back your lands. Less so of a land kind of fall loop in this deck, but still it mills 3 cards when it enters the battlefield. Blanchwood Prowler, when it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. Shigeki allows us to bring cards back from the graveyard. Same with the Dryad's Revival, returning target card from your graveyard to your hand with flashback. And then we've got Chupacabra Echo, which gives -X, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. And then we've got Urtai Resurrected, which allows us to have a creature that also works as removal. And then as far as the lands go, we've got the Takanuma Abandoned Mire, and then we've got Maestro's Theater, Obscura Storefront, and the Riveteer's Overlook, which are the sack lands that you see in Temur Control. And then Terramorphic Expanse, which is kind of like an Evolving Wilds. Sacrifice it, search your library for a basic card, and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So there are some rares in this build. It's not a 0 rares build, but the overall cost in paper is about $100. And it looks like a fun little deck to just try out casually on Arena. And the second budget list, and this one is a little bit... oh, sorry, the previous list is actually only like 20 bucks. This is the one that's closer to 100, I think. Let me check real quick. I forgot to write it down in my notes. Yeah, so Rise of the Varmints is $32 in paper, and this one is $101. But still relatively inexpensive as far as standard decks actually go. And this one is centered on the Vesuvian Duplimancy, and this is another deck by Saffron Olive. And so whenever you cast a spell that targets only a single artifact or creature you control, create a token that's a copy of that artifact or creature, except it's not legendary. So whenever we cast a spell that targets Outcast Trailblazer, it creates a copy of Outcaster Trailblazer. When Outcaster Trailblazer enters the battlefield, we add 1 mana of any color, and then whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, we draw a card. And so the loop is centered around this, creating copies of this, because it draws us a card, gives us a mana, and then the rest of the deck is all 1-cost spells that you can use to target the Outcaster Trailblazer. And as well as interaction for our opponents. So we've got Fading Hope, Otherworldly Gaze. That one's more to fill our graveyard and find our pieces. But Shore Up can target it. Take the Fall can target it. Timely Interference can target it and draw a card. Ancestral Anger can target it. The Safekeeping can be used in your opponent's removal as well as to start the loop. And then we have 1 copy of Song of Totentons, which allows us to tap for X and create... basically give everything haste. So once we have all of these Trailblazers, we can then do the Song of Totentons for X equals 0. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn, and then they can all attack in. So kind of a fun little combo to check out in Arena. I'm not sure that it's particularly competitive, but they're always fun to explore, and good for just getting dailies done. And now for the sweaty decks, right? The competitive decks. So this week I'm going to cover 7 best of 3 decks and then 7 best of 1 decks. And so we've got quite a bit to get through. And but first up here is Azorius Control. And what I like to do is I like to look at the standard challenge on Moto as kind of the I think it's some really top-end gameplay happens in those tournaments. So this was a first-place winner for the Standard Challenge 32 on May 11th, Azorius Control by Jabberwocky. And if we compare this to week 3, so if you're new here, what I like to do every week is look at how the deck is changing over time to kind of give you an idea of what are the cards that aren't in the core, what are some of the cards that are being explored and taken out. And I think it's a really cool way to go about it, even if I if I do say so myself. So Jabberwocky decided to bring in an additional copy of the Tishana's Tidebinder, and particularly good at silencing the activated or triggered abilities. Lots of targets for this: Azorius Control, Boros Convoke, Temur Control in response to Aftermath Analyst. It's just very good meta right now for the Tishana's Tidebinder. Dropping 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor, it's going into the sideboard, and then bringing in 1 copy of Jace the Perfected Mind. And this is particularly good against the other control matchups where you have an additional win condition, which is milling your opponent. We've got 2 additional copies of March of Otherworldly Light to bring this up to a total of 4. Again, this is particularly good against the Boros Convoke strategy, being able to hit their Gleeful Demolition target and fizzle it. If you are curious about the what cards are best in which matchups, I will be covering the best of 3 sideboard guide for Azorius Control, which goes into just that. So look for that on Friday. Since Azorius Control seems to be a very popular pick in the best of 3 tournament scene. And then we're taking out the 1 copy of Phantom Interference, as well as the 1 copy of Destroy Evil, and the 1 copy of Get Lost, and the 1 copy of Farewell. And as far as the lands go, we're taking out a Darker Wastes, and we're bringing in an additional island, and cutting the Meticulous Archive, which is the Surveil land in Azorius, and bringing in 1 copy of Mirrex, which the reason why you see Mirrex sometimes come and go in the Azorius Control list is because it does make casting No More Lies on turn 2 particularly hard if you have multiple copies of Mirrex. So Jabberwocky deciding to bring in 1 copy here, and then going up 1 planes. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that they've gotten rid of the Dust Animus, which was the lifelinker from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and also got rid of Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, which was a good counter to the Boros Convoke strategy, and as well as it's okay against Domain and anything with interesting ETBs, so it affects Temur Control to an extent as well, preventing the landfall trigger. So and getting rid of the Hullbreaker Horror, which was a kind of an alternative threat, alternative win condition. Ditching the 2 copies of Kutzil's Flanker, which was being used against the Temur Control to attack our opponent's graveyard. We've dropped 1 Tishana's Tidebinder in the sideboard and brought it into the main. And ditched the 2 copies of Negate, so no negates in this list, deciding to bring in an additional copy of Rest in Peace. And some people have decided that 1 Rest in Peace and 2 Kutzil's Flankers is better because these do they don't work well in duplicates, because they do the same effect, right? So unless your first one gets destroyed, then the second one can kind of be a dead card in your hand. So we've seen some people kind of preferring to do the 1 copy instead of 2, and Jabberwocky deciding to bring in both Rest in Peace, 2 copies. And then Sea Devil was being explored, and that one was particularly good for copying the World Soul's Rage in Temur Control and then shooting it back at your opponent before it resolved. So getting rid of the Sea Double, and instead bringing in 1 copy of the Chromhost Sea Shark as an alternative win condition, which can also help you with staying wide with the Boros Convoke strategy, and sometimes giving you alternative threats if your opponent is playing a lot of board wipes. Again, if you want to go deep into the archetype, I recommend my best of 3 sideboard guide on Friday. And we've brought in 3 copies of Knockout Blow, expecting there to be some more mono red showing up in the tournament scene. And 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, so that if we are up against another control matchup, we can bring in all 3 copies of Jace and really lean into milling our opponents out. And then same thing if we're up against the Azorius Control with the or any deck that struggles with Planeswalkers, then we can bring in the 4th copy of the Wandering Emperor from the sideboard. And then same thing with Farewell. If it's a favorable matchup, we can bring that in instead of running it in the main, bringing it in when it is favored to do so. All right, second place for the standard challenge was also taken down by Azorius Control by Mestari Maddie. And we're going to skip that one because it was the same one as the list I covered in week 3, except for one change in the best of 3 sideboard, which was they took out the C double and brought in a second copy of Rest in Peace. So both Azorius Control winners deciding to run 2 copies of the Rest in Peace instead of the C double. And but third place was taken down by a Gruul Ramp by Zelesnia, and this one is a new archetype. So always exciting to see innovation happening in week 4 of the Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And so this one is all about ramping into big green and red threats. So we've got Smuggler's Surprise, which allows to put 2 cards from your hand onto the battlefield. You can also use it for recursion, or you can make it so that creatures with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, so that you can dodge a Wrath outside of Sunfall, like Depopulate. We've got Glimpse the Core, which helps us find lands and put them into play. We've got Brotherhood's End, which is the this deck list's choice for the Wrath against Boros Convoke. We've got the Outcaster Trailblazer, which, similar to the budget list that we talked about earlier, just works well with the theme of drawing cards as well as creating mana anytime. Well, it creates mana on the turn that you play it. And you can plot it so that you can hit it. You can skip, right? You can plot it on turn 3, and then on turn 5 have 5 mana to slam like your Terror of Peaks. We've got Topiary Stomper, which fits into the power 4 to draw a card off of Trailblazer, as well as finding lands, putting them into the battlefield for ramp. We've got Map the Frontier, which allows us to search our library and bring those cards into the battlefield, kind of like an explosive vegetation. And then, and notably, we're seeing a move away from an Invasion of Zendikar and in Domain as well. And that's partially because we're seeing so much more Tidebinder in Azorius Control, which is really good to silence the battle and is a pretty good response to somebody playing the Invasion of Zendikar. So we're starting to see people exploring more of the sorcery speed ramp instead of the battle, because then it gets around the Tidebinders. And then we've got 4 copies of Terror of the Peaks, and this is just an amazing threat to ramp into. And it's a 5/4 flyer that if your opponent targets it, it costs 3 life for them to target it, and then you can give it hexproof, and they just lost the 3 life. And then with like the Smuggler's Surprise, and then whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that's power equals to that creature's power to any target. And so if you're slamming in an Atali's dealing 7 damage to whatever you want, including your opponent's face. And then Atali, is just an amazing card. It digs into your opponent's deck, and we've got the Spinewood's Armadillo, which is good top end that also helps us ramp by searching for a library, putting it into our hand, so it helps us find our land drops. Trumpeting Carnosaur, discovering into our big threats. And then we've got Calamity, Galloping Inferno, which was a new one from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, that when, if you saddle it for 1, which is kind of like Crew, if you haven't played Outlaws of Thunder Junction yet, you tap it at sorcery speed, and then if you saddle it and then you attack with it, if this has been saddled, the creature that saddled it becomes a token, and you get 2 copies of that token. My goodness, I'm having a hard time. Sorry. So it does have to be a non-legendary creature, so you can't do silly things like choose a Tali to saddle your Calamity. But Terror of the Peaks is not a legendary, and neither is the Trumpeting Carnosaur and the Spinewood's Armadillo, which the tokens entering the battlefield do trigger the ETB effects. And so very interesting archetype. I really like what this is doing, and again, happy to see the innovation happening pretty late into the format. And as far as the sideboard goes, we've got Pick Your Poison, which is really good against like the Esper midrange, being able to hit their enchantments as an edict, or kill something that has flying, so good against the Dimir midrange that we've kind of seen decrease in popularity. But there's some really good targets for Pick Your Poison in the meta, and you can also use it against Urabrask Forge and mono red. Turn the Earth is in here primarily to prevent your opponent from milling you out, so that you can put a pause on your upkeep before you draw, and then put this back in to give you an additional turn. Volcanic Spite for a little bit of removal that also can be used to kind of fix your hand. Brotherhood's End, again, is particularly good to have the 4 copies against the go wide board strategies of like Boros Convoke. Cavern of Souls, being able to bring in an additional copy here if we are up against a control archetype, so that we can get our Terror of the Peaks down and such without having them just get countered. And then we've got oh, hey, thank you for the sub. I forgot to turn that off. And then we've got 3 copies of Tranquil Frillback, and this one again gives you that graveyard hate, kind of like the Kutzel's Flanker. But you can also use it for artifact or enchantment hate, and you can also just use it against to stabilize against mono red because it gains 4 life. So 3 copies there, and then we've got the Obstinate Baloth, which is good against Lily. Anything that's making you discard Obstinate Baloth, then you can play for free. And then it also does fairly well against the mono red matchup because it gains 4 life. And then we have the Tyrannix Rex, and we're seeing more and more of this one coming in as a favorable threat if you are in green, because it can't be countered, and then it has Ward 4, and it's an 8/8, so it's a great top-end threat, and particularly good if you're dealing with a bunch of counter spells. All right, and the tradition of having multiple standard challenges is continuing. So we had 2 standard challenge 32s on May 11th. So in the second set of the tournament, first place was taken down by Temur Land Control by Ballesta 93. And if we compare this one to week 3 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, they've done a pretty straightforward change here, which is they brought in the 3 copies of... This is not the right one. Sorry, I had the wrong one. There's multiple Temur Control lists that we'll be covering this week. So this one is the one by Ballesta. I apologize. So we've got 3 copies of Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy being brought in. And then we're cutting out 1 Fires of Victory that we saw come in from the Pro Tour, and cutting 1 copy of Spelunking and 1 Virtue of Strength to bring in Kellen. And again, I do have a best of 3 sideboard, and I will be revisiting them if you are curious about like what matchups is Kellen particularly good at. And generally, the better body is really where the advantage of running Kellen comes in, as well as being able to ramp. So best of 3 sideboard, though, the... we compare it to week 3, we see that they ditched the 1 copy of the Doppelgang, as well as Negate, and pick 1 copy of Pick Your Poison, so still running 2 there. And brought in 1 copy of 3 Steps Ahead, which was the counterspell that we typically see in Azorius Control. And so that one is definitely one where caught me off guard. And then we're bringing in Colossal Sky Turtle, which is a common one that we see because it loops with the Shigeki Jukai Visionary to infinitely combo getting stuff back from your graveyard. And then we're bringing in the Tyrannix Rex as an alternative win condition, similar to what we saw in the Gruul Ramp strategy. Okay, and then second place was taken down by the Temur Land combo deck, or the Temur Control deck, by Ovilm Cabrera. Probably massacring names. I do my best. I'm sorry. And so if we compare this one to week 3, then sorry, this was the list that I had confused. This one is leaning a little bit more into what we usually see being explored for speeding up the deck, especially against like mono red. And so if we compare this one to week 3, we can see that they brought the Colossal Sky Turtle in the main instead of bringing it in from the main. Or sorry, bringing 1 copy into the main to give us the infinite loop in the main. We're bringing in 1 Light of the Night, and this is, if you go back and you look at my sideboard guide, this is the card that I was talking about that was typical to bring in with the addition of the Galvanic Iteration, specifically against mono red. And so deciding to lean that way, and also run 1 Turn the Earth in the main, which is, again, an answer so that you can't be milled out. It gives you 1 additional turn if you are up against Jace the Perfected Mind. And then we've also got 1 Into the Fire, which was an alternative to the Vampire's Vengeance, being able to deal 2 damage to each creature. And then if you don't have a good target for it, you can also put your dead cards into the bottom of your library and then draw that many cards +1. If you do need to find your World Soul's Rage, can kind of give you an alternative to the Memory Deluge to dig for those answers. As far as the sideboard goes, They decided to ditch 1 Bonnie Paul Clear Cutter, which has been a common alternative win condition in the sideboard, and ditch 1 copy of Abrade, which is the sideboard strategy for against the artifact, giving us some artifact hate, and ditching 1 copy of the Pick Your Poison, and bringing the 1 Turn the Earth from the sideboard into the main, and ditching 1 Vampire's Vengeance. And largely because I think they're running the Into the Fire. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the Malevolent Hermit, and this is one that I haven't seen before, but I like the direction that it's going, because you can sacrifice it to counter-target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3. So it's a way to protect your Aftermath Analyst and your Nissa Resurgent Animist from early hate, so that you can get your... Because like, one thing that this deck can struggle with is early disruption from your opponent's plays, stopping your landfall until turn 6. So if you can protect that from happening, then this can give you a really good thing. And then non-creature spells you control can't be countered when you flip it over for the disturb side. Makes it so that if you are up against Azorius Control, they can't counter your World Soul's Rage. So I like this inclusion. I'm really curious to see how it runs. And then we're bringing in Titania, Voice of Gaia. And this one is particularly good against the more aggressive matchups like Dimir midrange, mono red. Because of the life gain, you gain a whole bunch of life when you have Titania, Voice of Gaia in play. And then we're bringing in 1 copy of the Tranquil Frillback to give us some graveyard hate against the mirror match. And then bringing in 1 copy of the Hullbreaker Horror as an alternative win condition that we typically see in Azorius Control lists. So getting creative here in the sideboard this week. All right, and then 3rd place for the Standard Challenge 32 on May 11th was taken down by Azorius Control by Igor Meister. And if we compare this to week 3, so this is the 3rd Azorius Control list, and Temur Control. So there's a lot of control in the best of 3 tournament scene. And so this one, exact same list that we saw in week 3 as far as what was in the main, but they did decide to change the lands around a little bit. So they brought in an additional copy of the Darker Waste, cut an island, cut the 1 Meticulous Archive, which again is the Surveil Azorius land, and brought in 2 copies of Mirrex, which can be a little bit can give you weird tension with the No More Lies, but gives you an alternative win condition. And then ditching 1 Plains and 1 Sea Chrome Coast to bring in a Sunken Citadel. And this one works particularly well with your manlands and your Mirrex being able to give you 2 mana if you are using this to activate your land sources. And then as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've seen that they brought in an additional Kutzil's Flanker, and they ditched the Rest in Peace. So instead of doing the 1 Rest in Peace and the 2 flankers, they went for the 3. And I like this because like the versatility of it. Flanker can still be a relevant sideboard card if you are coming up against mono red. And so multiple signs throughout the top winners that they were teched a little bit more heavily against mono red this week. And then they ditched 1 copy of the Destroy Evil, which I think, I mentioned in previous previous episodes that I thought that the Destroy Evil was probably going to get dropped from a lot of lists, because we saw enchantments getting dropped from the Esper midrange, or at least in some lists at the Pro Tour. And so seeing that here, and then bringing in an additional copy of Negate, and particularly good against Azorius Control, so bumping up to 3 copies there. And taking out the C double. So again, all 3 lists not leaning into the C double, throw the Temur Control answer back in their face, and instead running a single copy of the Knockout Blow, anticipating maybe mono red. All right, now for Standard Challenge 64 on May 12th. First place was taken down by Esper Control by Bill Sive. And this one is a new archetype. So it's kind of taking aspects of the Dimir control list that we've been seeing, and the basically then adding white for No More Lies, Temporary Lockdown, and the Wandering Emperor. So we've got the 3 steps ahead, we've got Cut Down, we've got Go for the Throat, Long Goodbye, a lot of really good interaction. Siphon Insight to attack our opponent's deck, because one of the ways that this deck does win is through mill. And then we've got Temporary Lockdowns, Tishana's Tidebinder for hitting our opponent's Planeswalkers, the Wandering Emperor and Jace, kind of classic that we've seen, Memory Deluge to find the right threat at the right time, and then 4 copies of Deadly Cover-Up, where you can use this to also hate on something in your opponent's graveyard and exile all of it, kind of giving you the end. And I think what really puts this over the top of other Azorius or other control lists is that it is good at destroying other control, right? So you're going to lose some consistency by bringing in the three colors over just running 2, but you have more answers than what either control list is bringing, right? And lots of fixing to get the lands to work. And then as far as the sideboard goes, we've got Duress to hate on other control and other spell heavy lists, an additional copy of Long Goodbye, 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, and we've seen this a fair amount where you have 2 copies in the main, and then you have 2 copies in the sideboard, and you bring in all 4 if it is a favorable matchup, like Boros Convoke. We've got Chromehose Sea Shark, which we've seen in the other Azorius Control lists. Outrageous Robbery, giving us a mill condition, and Destroy Evil, 2 copies of Negate, 2 Kutzel's Flankers, against the Temur Control matchup, 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder, so we can bring these all the way up to 4 if it is a favorable matchup, and then we have the Hullbreaker Horror, very similar to the Azorius Control, giving us an alternative win condition. All right, and the 7th and final best of 3 list that I'll cover here is the Temur Land Control combo, or Temur Control by Ultra Super Bob. And they took down 2nd place on the Standard Challenge 64 on May 12th. And if we compare this to week 3 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we can see that this is the exact same list. The only changes happening in the best of 3 sideboard. So they've ditched the 2 copies of Bonnie Paul, as well as the Titan of Industry, and 1 copy of Abrade, and the 2 copies of the Vampire's Vengeance. Instead, they are bringing 1 of the Fires of Victory from the main into the sideboard, or running an additional copy of the Fires of Victory. Looking at Seismic Wave as an alternative to the Vampire's Vengeance, being able to deal 1 damage to each non-artifact creature and 2 damage to a specific target, so 3 if it's a non-artifact creature, may be a better option than the Vampire's Vengeance against Boros Convoke, because a lot of Boros Convoke does have only 1 toughness. It depends on if they're running the War Leader's Call, right? But then we have the 2 copies of the Tyrannix Rex, again, this being a very popular alternative win condition, anticipating a bunch of Azorius Control in the meta. And then to finish up the tournaments, the 3rd place was taken down by 4-color Legends, or 4-color Slogurk, by Kathankit 26. And the reason why I skipped it, though, is that if we compare it to the 2nd version that I covered in the Pro Tour in week 2, so 2 weeks ago, it had very few changes. So it's basically the Pro Tour list. So they ditched 1 Restless Cottage, and they brought in a Sunken Citadel, and in the best of 3 sideboard, they ditched Shieldred the Apocalypse in favor of Rakdos the Muscle. So now for best of 1, though, if if best of 3 is not your jam and you like to just play aggro decks on the best of 1 ladder, I don't blame you. And so what I like to do for best of 1, since we don't really have a best of 1 tournament and it doesn't really make sense, I think it makes a little bit more sense to look at tracker data, and that way we can kind of look at what deck has been working for the majority of people. And so this week, number 1 was, according to Untapped, which is my tracker of choice, was Boros Convoke. And if we compare this one to last week's list, we can see that we finally are seeing Inspiring Vantage. But we're seeing the Nurturing Pixies that we saw in week 1 of the tournament scene in Best of 3. This is particularly good for picking up picking up your Sanguine Evangelist. There's a lot of really good targets for the Nurturing Pixie to get you additional value later in the game. And we're ditching the 4 copies of the Ocean Frontliner, which is the colorless artifact, and we're ditching 1 copy of the Sanguine Evangelist and bringing the Case of the Gateway Express up to 4. The last week was favoring a 2-2 split because we were seeing more control sneaking into the best of 1 ladder. And so now we're back to the 4 copies, and but still keeping 1 copy of the War Leader's Call. And then we're also bringing in 1 copy of the Invasion of Gobakon. And this one, if you go back and you look at my best of 3 sideboard guide for Boros Convoke, Invasion of Gobakon is particularly good against certain matchups where you're affecting their tempo. So it's really good against mono red, and it's very good against Esper midrange, and if I remember correctly. And so, in the best of 1, you're going to see a lot of mono red. So I kind of like the inclusion of the Invasion of Gobakon, and I'd actually be curious about playing around with maybe bringing in a little bit more, maybe over the War Leader's Call. Really depends, again, on what you're experiencing on the ladder. Are you experiencing control, or are you experiencing a bunch of mono red? And so this one kind of trying to address a little bit of both with their conditional options. And then as far as the lands go, we're ditching 1 copy of the Cavern of Souls, which is another sign that I think Azorius Control, at least in the best of 1 meta, has died down a little bit. And we're bringing out 2 plains and 1 mountain, and bringing in the 3 copies of the Inspiring No, I had it right the first time. The 4 copies of the Inspiring Vantage, and which we saw, makes sense, way better than running the Thran portals. And the downside with using the tracker data is that usually takes a little while for the best versions to kind of come to the front. So almost a month in, we're finally seeing Inspiring Vantage, and this is a pretty obvious inclusion in my mind. And then we've got 1 copy of Merrick's to give us a little bit of an alternative win condition, because it can trigger ETBs off of War Leader's Call. And running 22 lands instead of 21. So second was Mono White Humans, and I'm going to skip that one this week because it was the exact same list as week 3 that I covered last week. And but it's a natural counter to the Mono Red decks. So if you haven't played if you're really sick of the Mono Red and Mono Red Prowess beating you up, play Mono White. Play Mono White Humans as a natural counter. And but third place was Mono Red Prowess, and we do see some changes compared to week 3. So we're ditching the 1 copy of the Fugitive Codebreaker and taking down Godric, 2 copies, and instead bringing in 2 more copies of Shock, so leaning really heavily into these direct damage spells, and bringing up the Demonic Ruckus back up to 4 copies. Last week it was dropped down to 2. And cutting 1 mountain, again, no tokens on, just running strictly basic mountains and settling for 19. And by the way, if you haven't played the Prowess deck, it's a lot of fun. The problem is that, like, you can't play it for 100 matches without getting kind of bored, right? It's a lot of the same thing. But it's exciting to get that turn 3 win, and that deck is leaning very heavily into getting the turn 3 win. As far as the next up on the list is Mono Red Aggro, and this one is a little bit slower than the Prowess deck, and leans a little bit more into creature synergies, a little less completely blown out by disruption. And but if we compare this one to the one that I covered last week, we can see that they've ditched the 1 copy of Shivan Devastator, which is the X flyer, the XX dragon that can kind of synergize with Godric, and bringing in 1 copy of the Bloodthirsty Adversary and 1 copy of the Charming Scoundrel. The versatility of this is really cool, by the way. If you have no cards in hand, it's a free card draw, and then you can also create a treasure token to ramp into some really cool turns, or you can just put a Wicked Roll token attached to your Phoenix Chick to make it a little bit more relevant and attacking in the air, right? So like the versatility of like what you do with this. Whenever I play this card, I have ended up using all 3 options. Probably the Wicked Roll and Treasure Token the most, as opposed to the discard and draw. But, it can definitely help in a pinch. And then we've got so they're ditching the 2 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker and the Monstrous Rage. And then for the lands, we've got 1 less mountain, bringing in Soken'Zon, Crucible of Defiance. Makes sense, it's going to be going a little bit longer. And then 2 copies of Mishra's Foundry. So this week favoring 22 lands instead of 20. All right, and then number 5 was Azorius Control. So if you're hoping to escape those control matches, I have bad news for you. Best of 1 still has them, although they are way less common than in best of 3. But number 5 was Azorius Control, and if we compare this one to the last week's list, we can see that they've ditched the 4 copies of the Kutzil's Flanker, and that one being a typical one that you bring in against Temur Control, but also good at stabilizing against Mono Red, and brought out the Get Lost, and 1 copy of the Temporary Lockdown, so running 3 copies of Temporary Lockdown instead of 4, and we're bringing in an additional copy of the Celestis, which helps us with filtering through our lands as well as giving us life gain. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of Sunfall. So the previous list was running 1 Sunfall, 1 Farewell. And so we're bringing that one up to 3. And then ditching the 1 copy of Farewell and leaning on the Soul Partitions, which we've kind of seen come and go. This one, exiling a permanent and making it cost 2 more is particularly good against Mono Red, where a 3-cost thing making a 3-costed thing cost 2 more to cast basically removes it from the game because of them abusing a low land count. So and then we've got the 2 knockout blows, which I kind of like the Kutzil's Flanker because you cover yourself against the Temur Control as well. But this just strictly better against the Boros Convoke list and Mono Red. And I guess the Kutzil Flanker doesn't help you as much against the Boros Convoke. So I guess that's the pro and con. And then we've got 2 copies of the 3 Steps Ahead, which is the catch-all spree counterspell from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. A lot of really good versatility on this, and at the floor it is a cancel. And then we've got, as far as the lands go, we've gone down to 1 copy of Aganjo, Seat of the Empire. The previous list was running 3. We've ditched 3 copies of the Field of Ruin, and favoring the Demolition Field instead. And brought in 1 island, and ditched the 4 copies of Meticulous Archive, which was the Surveil land in Azorius, and got rid of 2 of the Seachrome Coast, and brought in 3 copies of the Azorius Painland, A Darker Wastes, and yeah, the Demolition Fields, and 1 copy of Merix. So running 26 lands instead of 28. And I'm personally, I know that the best of 1 hand smoother is going to change things. Control wants to hit its land drops. I think Control is happiest at 28 lands. Personally, I can't get behind the 26 versus 28. But part of the reason why I use tracker data is because it removes what I think, my bias, right? So this was the top list this week for Azorius Control. All right, next up is Boros Heroic, and I've seen the Ash Lizzle playing this one a lot, and I think maybe they were the ones that created it in the first place. It's an archetype that's been hanging around, so it's hard to say that Ash Lizzle should get full credit, but it definitely got some interesting tools, and I've been keeping my eye on it, and it hasn't popped into the top 8 until now. And so it's not one of the top performing best of 1 decks, but it's a lot of fun to play, and it has similarities to the mono red Prowess deck, but it's leaning a little bit more into the creature synergies of the Double Striker Illuminator Virtuoso, which works really nicely with the Demonic Ruckus being able to target it and get its toughness up above 1. Because that was the biggest part, was that it was kind of fragile to play this out on turn 2. So if you plot this on 1, you can then immediately cast it on there, triggering the Connive, and you can get it up to 3 toughness, which is a lot harder for mono red to remove. They have to use a lightning bolt instead of a shock, right? But basically, yeah, you're trying to use Slick Shot Show Off and the Illuminator Virtuoso to hit for a ton of damage. We've also got the Monetary Swift Spears and the Fugitive Codebreakers, and the combat tricks that we see in Mono Red Prowess, like Ancestral Anger, the Monstrous Rage, Kumano, Play with Fire. But the reason why we're bringing in white, outside of the Double Striker, is that we have Lauren's Escape, which allows us to have better answers to our opponent's early interaction, which this deck can struggle with. And then Homestead Courage, which allows us to get multiple combat tricks in 1 card, and gives us Vigilance so that we can play defensively against other decks. The downside is that it's a little bit harder than, bringing in an additional color brings in inconsistencies in the mana base, so you're going to want to run the Inspiring Vantages and such. But this deck is also a lot of fun to play, and is quite capable of getting a turn 3 win as well. Number 7 was Rakdos Aggro, and I have a hard time calling this one Rakdos Aggro because it's not even actually playing the black to play the Callous Sellsword. And honestly, though, I played 50 matches of the Rakdos Aggro deck, and it basically doesn't need the black, right? I mean, maybe I won 1 game off of actually casting the Callous Sellsword. The important part of the Sellsword is the Fling ability, Burn Together. So if you combine this in particular with the Cacophony Scamp, you can do absurd amounts of damage in 1 turn. So if Scamp gets through unblocked, it deals its damage. You then fling it, sorcery speed, but it deals its damage again, and then when it dies, it deals its damage equal to its power to any target. So you can triple the power of Cacophony Scamp. So if you can get this up to 7, you can deal 21 damage in 1 turn, and then the rest of the deck, similar to the mono red Prowess deck, is just running a bunch of combat tricks. So if we compare this one to the one that I covered in week 2, we've gone down 1 copy of the Callous Sellsword, because it can be awkward when we have a whole bunch of flings and nothing to fling. Brought out the 4 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker, and instead are running the Kenra Spell Spear, which can transform for 3 and a Phyrexian blue mana, so you can pay life instead of the blue mana to flip this into a double Prowess that gets +1/+1 twice each time that you cast a spell. And then 4 copies of the Slick Shot Show Off, which is going to become a staple, I think, in the mono red archetypes. And then we've got the one additional copy of the Felonious Rage up to a total of 4, and bringing up Antagonize up to a total of 4 as well, which really can pack a punch with the double strike kind of experience of the Cacophony Scamp. So really leaning into that, and less so into the Blazing Crescendo. So Blazing Crescendo giving +3/+1 instead of +4/+3, but it does help you dig into additional stuff. And similarly, we're also getting rid of the Case of the Crimson Pulse, and that one was another card that was being explored for more dig. And what they decided to do instead was ditch the Sulphurous Springs and the Sokenzon and 1 mountain, and go for a greedy 17 lands only instead of the 20 lands. That way we can, hardly ever flood out, and kind of justify ditching some of the dig of Blazing Crescendo and Case of the Crimson Pulse. However, when you start messing around with this, this is starting to abuse the Best of 1 hand smoother, and will work worse in paper. So something to keep in mind if you are playing these decks in paper, you don't have the Best of 1 hand smoother that Arena has. And then number 8 is Dimir Midrange, and this one's a different Dimir Midrange than what we saw during Murders of Karlov Manor in the Best of 3 scene, although it has some similarities. So this one is a new archetype, and this one is another one that I've been keeping my eye on. And so, its key card is the Proft's Eidetic Memory. And so when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You have no maximum hand size. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've drawn more than 1 card, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the number of cards that you've drawn this turn -1. So this was a popular deck during Murders of Karlov Manor, but it never really made it into the top 8. So similar to the Boros Heroic archetype, we're starting to see some of these that I've kept my eyes on for a couple of weeks finally get into the spotlight. But the rest of the deck is just centered around drawing, right? So you've got Ledger Shredder that can connive. You've got good disruption with Deep Cavern Bat, go for the throat, cut down. Spyglass Siren kind of gives you that early flyer that works really well with Gix. And then we've got Spell Pierce for some disruption, Consider to draw cards cheaply, and then Evangel of Synthesis, which enters the battlefield drawing a card. Again, leaning more into this Proft's Eidetic Memory. Steamcore Scholar deck, which I've heard some people call it the Steamcore deck as well. Basically, when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards, so then it works particularly well with the Eidetic Memory. And then you got Gix, which works really well with the early flyers. That one that one we saw a lot in the Best of 3 scene for Dimir Midrange. And then we've got 2 copies of Shieldred Apocalypse as the top end. So cool to see, what was that, a total of 4 new archetypes in week 4 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I've really been enjoying the meta. I do understand people's frustrations, especially in Best of 3. If you don't like playing against like several different flavors of control, it's not a particularly good time to be a mid-range player, because Best of 1 is entirely aggro, and then Best of 3 is entirely control. But we still see a very healthy meta, a lot of different decks that are bringing alternative strategies and kind of a rock, paper, scissors to the meta. So like Azorius Control is weak against the Temur Landfall deck, and and on down the line, right? And you've got the interesting sideboard options, and it's nice to have a diversity. I've played Standard where there's only one deck and everybody's playing it, and that gets pretty boring. So remember to click like and subscribe if you like this sort of thing. I do a meta review every Monday, and on Tuesday and Wednesday I tend to do my draft guides for the current set, and then on Friday will be a Best of 3 sideboard guide, and then on Saturday will be my gameplay, and on Sunday will be a meta breaker, which is kind of the off-meta picks each week that I run for my gameplay episode on Saturday. So that's the general schedule overall. And thank you for being a part of my community, and good luck crushing your matches in tournaments and climbing the ladder. And I'll see you all later.